to the September 23rd, 2021 Planning Commission Committee of the Whole meeting. This committee provides an opportunity to have an in-depth conversation with items contained on the agenda. Items referred to the committee are usually deemed inconsistent with the 2030 comp plan. The committee discussion is less formal as compared to the regular planning commission meetings. And there's generally no time limits for speakers to give their presentations. Any issues that participants have with the technology, please send a message to the moderator, Ray All. I would ask for commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of any presentation for public comments. Finally, please be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. We have one item on our agenda today. The item is text change TC 1321. This item, this TC amends the 10-part UDO to modify when a protective yard is required for vehicle sales in the NX, CX, DX, and IX districts. Mr. Keegan McDonald from Planning and Development will present a staff presentation at this time.
All right, thanks very much. Just bear with me while I pull up the presentation. Okay, is that displaying all right for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So this is a external text change request labeled TC 1321. It deals with the use standards that are applicable to vehicle fuel sales. And because I know this committee doesn't typically hear these cases, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background. The process for requesting a text change from an external person or member of the public has changed slightly. And so an application is filed, which was done in this case on July 26th. We delivered a report to council outlining the request, potential impacts, etc., on August 17th, 2021. They then subsequently authorized that text change. And again, it would amend specific use standards for vehicle fuel sales in NX, CX, DX, and IX districts. So the existing regulations for these districts for vehicle fuel sales currently requires a Type 2 protective yard when the property containing that use abuts a residential district or residential use. So the Type 2 protective yard actually comes from the neighborhood transitions section of the code. And the nuance here is that neighborhood transitions could even still apply to a property that contains vehicle fuel sales. However, neighborhood transitions only deal with the boundary between zoning districts. So it really only matters when there's a residential district adjacent to a mixed-use district. In this instance, there's a few requirements that sort of differ in that this Type 2 protective yard also comes into play when the property abuts a residential use. So it could be a residential use that sits on a mixed use zoning district property. Also, typically the neighborhood transitions give you a suite of options. You're able to provide either a more narrow or larger protective yard, depending on your preference and maybe the site design. In this instance, the Type 2 is prescribed and it's the only option. The other nuance is that this use standard requires the inclusion of a wall, whereas typically a Type 2 protective yard gives the option for either a wall or a fence. So the use standard is a little bit more stringent in this case for those reasons. And the applicant is not looking to change any of the specific requirements of this Type 2 protective yard, but rather the trigger when it is required for the vehicle fuel sales use. And here's just a description. I'm sure you all are pretty well aware of how neighborhood transitions operate with your work in the rezoning realm, but just a quick refresher, you can see typically with neighborhood transitions, which again could still come into play because they're relevant to the tiering of the site plan and not necessarily just the use, but those provisions could still come into play. And the option that's prescribed by this specific use standard today is Type 2. Whereas under normal conditions, you have an option between Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. So the proposed regulations would require this type 2 protective yard for a vehicle fuel sales use when the fuel pump island associated with the use is within 100 feet of a residential district or use. And so I wanted to show this graphic, and I believe this is along New Bern Avenue, just two fuel stations that actually happen to be right next to each other, just so you can see the difference in terms of property boundary versus fuel pump boundary. In this case, both of these properties are zoned NX, and so they're actually buffered somewhat, or not buffered, but distanced a little bit away from most of those residential uses. But I just wanted to show that illustration for the committee's benefit. So by their nature, vehicle fuel sales often involve ingress and egress of vehicles. There are often accessory uses such as retail sales or air and vacuum services, which contribute to the overall activity on the site. And furthermore, they require regular visitation by large vehicles to refill underground storage tanks. And so all of this necessitates the provision of screening and landscaping to dampen the audible and visual impacts of the use, particularly from nearby residential areas. And so the intention here is, again, not to remove this requirement altogether, but just change when it is applied, as opposed to requiring it when there is when the property simply abuts a district boundary. This would pay more close attention to the spatial relationship between the fuel pump island, which is kind of recognized as the central node of activity for this use, and any adjoining residential district or use. And I do have another illustration at the end that I think will highlight this kind of discrepancy a little bit more clearly, and why the applicant believes this particular proposal is more nuanced and will lead to the same or better outcomes in most instances. So again, the purpose is that the current regulations really don't account for the distance between the vehicle fuel sales use and the adjacent residential districts or uses. And as I mentioned earlier, the fuel pump islands seem to be a more reasonable point of measurement or comparison, as opposed to just the property boundary, which in some instances is sort of arbitrary, especially on a large site, which may contain multiple uses. And so that's sort of what's driving the need for this particular change. The impacts, again, utilizing a distance measurement would exempt fuel sales uses on larger properties from having to comply with the protective yard, and ensure impactful operations are not exempted due to an arbitrary relationship between property boundaries, such as a small recombination or some type of small lot that could intersect a fuel sales use and a neighboring residential district or use. To reiterate, the specific protective yard standards would remain unchanged. It would still be a type 2 protective yard that's required by this use standard. It would still require a wall, etc. And so those specific criteria would not change. Here is the graphic that I had mentioned earlier, just showing how the regulations are applied today, particularly on large sites, and why that can be cumbersome and in some cases not really recognize the actual relationship between residential uses or districts and a fuel sales use. So in this instance, you can see an R10 property to the north, this CX3 property to the south, which is a large shopping center. A portion of the property is proposed to be redeveloped with a fuel sales use, and that's towards the bottom near Creedmoor Road. There's over 500 feet of distance between the residential district and the vehicle fuel sales use. However, the protective yard requirement, or excuse me, the use standard is still triggered today simply because one property abuts another, irrespective of how far the vehicle fuel sales use is from that specific boundary. It's also worth noting that these protective yard requirements cannot be varied at present. No use standard, unless explicitly stated, can receive a variance, so there's really no option for relief aside from subdivision or, of course, finding another site. I just wanted to provide a little bit more background before wrapping up my presentation, or a little bit more um, analysis, I guess, into the measurement that's proposed. So obviously, there is still a need to think about the specific distance that a fuel pump island should be from a neighboring property. We as staff discussed in concert with the applicant and feel the 100 feet distance properly accounts for some of the ancillary activity that takes place on site, specifically drive aisles or something of that nature that may, encircle a fuel pump island, which is pretty common, and feel that the 100 feet is appropriate. But of course, that measurement is to the discretion of the committee, but 100 feet is what we are proposing. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I did want to note, I believe we have at least one or two folks who have signed up to speak on this item, one being the applicant. And so I do think they would like to say a few words in support, but I'm happy to try and answer any technical questions that the committee might have.
Thanks, Keegan. Keegan, can you pull up the exact text change if you have it?
Yeah, if you would just bear with me, I can pull it up real quick and then reshare my screen.
Okay, so what we'll do in the meantime is answer any questions from the committee if we have any before we get to the applicant. I'm seeing none. Ray, could you please allow the applicant to speak?
Thank you, Commissioner Mann. Matthew Carpenter with Parker Poe, 301 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the applicant. Also on the call with me and available for questions are Garrett Maravets of Harris Teeter and Megan Fitzsimmons of Kinley Horn. Keegan did a great job explaining the request. As you know, the text change is not tied to any specific property, but the need for this text change arose from a specific project, and the context is helpful in understanding the proposed language. As an added convenience, Harris Teeter is seeking to construct an HT fuel center with several gas pumps in the parking lot of the existing Harris Teeter site, which was actually shown on the graphic that Keegan had up at 7400 Creedmoor Road. The fuel center would be on the same tax parcel as the existing Harris Teeter store, but at the front of the site near Creedmoor Road. And the rear of the store is currently, or sits adjacent to the Stonehenge apartment complex. And both of these properties have existed in the same configuration since the mid-'80s. There is currently a mature planted buffer between the rear of the shopping center and the apartments, and that buffer varies in width. And in discussing plans with the city, Harris Teeter became aware that the proposed fuel center at the front of the parking lot could trigger the requirement for a Type 2 protective yard, which includes a 6.5-foot wall at the rear of the store. And this is because of the current language for vehicle fuel sales uses, which requires a Type 2 medium protective yard when the property abuts a residential use or district. So here, because the fuel center and the grocery store would be on the same tax parcel, and the rear of the Harris Teeter is adjacent to the apartment complex, the current language would require the Type 2 medium protective yard for the full length of the property line behind the Harris Teeter. And this is despite the fact that there's at least 495 feet between the proposed fuel center location and the apartments. And so we believe this is an unintended application of the buffer requirement, which is intended to shield residential properties from the potentially harmful effects of gas stations. And the proposed language doesn't remove the requirement, but instead changes the trigger for when the vehicle fuel sales buffer is required. And so, we're proposing to change the trigger from when vehicle fuel sales use abuts a residential property to when the fuel pump island is within 100 feet of a residential district or use. One question did come up at the initial council meeting on this request about what type of buffer would be required. There were a new development, and these uses were placed on the same parcel like they are here. And the answer is that the neighborhood transition yard requirements would step in there and require one of the buffer options that Keegan mentioned in his presentation. And so to conclude, we think this is a modest change to the language and will better apply the vehicle fuel sales requirement in line with the goal of shielding residential properties from the negative effects of gas stations. And so we're available for any questions or points of clarification the board might have.
I have a quick question. Matt, is there a current gas station on the east end of that site? I think there is, but I might be
I
mistaken.
believe there's one on let's see.
At the corner of Creedmoor and is it Bridge?
Bridgeport? Yep.
Yeah.
There is, and so my understanding is that the fuel center would be just more of an added convenience when people are getting groceries, and they're leaving the parking lot, they can fill up, instead of having to pull out and then, enter that gas station. So.
Can you bring that map back, the map back up for me, please?
Absolutely. I also just wanted to let you know I do have the ordinance available too if you want me to share that at any point.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I didn't look at it correctly. It looks like that gas station is on a different parcel. I'm sorry. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, that's correct. It's a separate parcel. You can see the outline in red of the whole shopping center.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Do we have any questions or comments from the committee? Commissioner Dattell?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, has this issue ever come up before? Like is this a one-off kind of situation? Or does anybody know if we've run into this issue in other locations as well?
I'll let Keegan answer that. I haven't come across this specific issue before.
I've been working with the Board of Adjustment for approximately 3 years, and I'm not specifically aware of someone requesting or seeking options for relief related to this specific protective yard requirement. I will say protective yard requirements in general do cause a fair amount of headaches for people, given just the fact that they live in this use standard section of the code and cannot be varied. And they all have sort of different triggers. But I'm not specifically aware of any specific to vehicle fuel sales, but perhaps, I don't know if Justin Remetta, who's on the call, in his time in plan review has seen any either, but I'm not recalling anything specific.
What Matt, Matthew, and Keegan have said, it may come up from time to time, but in those instances, perhaps those applicants chose to try and find another site or realized, they were kind of stuck because the board can't grant the variances to this provision and ended up looking for another site. Obviously, this is the first time anyone's requested a text change for this provision.
Commissioner Rains.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Quick question for staff. I see that how this can address this particular case, but as Commissioner Dattell was asking, what about how does this impact other cases we may not have thought about? And particularly if there is a vehicle fuel sale use that has, say, a car wash building on the same plat, that's closer than 100 feet to the property line. Is that going to trigger transition yards as well, or because that can create a lot of noise and activity as well? So I'm just wondering if we're limiting it to the fuel sale island, if there's other functions on that piece of property, how do we address those, or has staff thought about that as well?
Yeah, we did think about it just generally, in the sense that we felt that the 100 feet would capture most things that might take place between the fuel pump island. But you do raise a good point on, on an extra large site. You could theoretically have a fuel pump island that's even further away. I will say car washes are their own principal use, and I'm not sure how those are treated in conjunction with the vehicle fuel sales use. It's my understanding that they would be evaluated separately, but I would defer to Justin on the call.
There are standards. So the vehicle fuel sales are allowed in NX, CX, IX, and DX. In the NX district, the least intensive of those, if a fuel sales use has car wash associated with it, there are limitations on the extent of the car wash. So there's limitations on how close, for example, vacuums and those sorts of things can be to the property lines, the noise level of those machines. It has to be a fully automatic wash, so it's not a kind of a get out and do it yourself. It's got to be like a drive-through thing. So those limitations do exist, but only in the NX district. In the other districts, they do not.
Commissioner Raines.
So, thank you. So if I'm hearing that right, so they can have sorry, I'm trying to get my words here. Car wash use on a similar vehicle fuel sale property in a CX district that's less than 100 feet from a residential district. So this text change wouldn't account for that particular case.
It would depend on whether the car wash was a separate principal use or not, or if it were just accessory to the vehicle sales. If it were just a small operation that's kind of contained to that, just you see them at some of the gas stations where you just drive through in the back, kind of accessory use. But if it's a more intense, larger scale type car wash, there are that may rise to the level of a separate principal use, and it does have its own set of regulations separate and apart from the vehicle fuel sales.
And I'll add to that if I can that I think the neighborhood transition yard requirement would probably apply in that scenario too if it was a new development.
Keegan, can you bring up the text change? And then at the same time, Ray, can you please present our next speaker to present, or if there's anybody from the public ready to speak?
There are no other, this is Carmen, there are no other persons signed up to speak specifically, although we do have 2 members of the applicant team who are here to answer questions. Megan representing Kinley Horn and Garrett representing Harris Teeter.
Okay. Can you just real brief outline the changes? I know we talked about the 100 feet, the distance, the buffer, like the fuel pump distance being 100 feet from a residential area. I can see that. How many pages is this text change we're looking at?
It is only 1 page of real text. It doesn't flow onto a second page, but it's really just this text highlighted in 4. Yes. So the specific change that's being made is there's essentially a qualifier or preamble that's being added to the protective yard requirement. So at present, it just reads that a type 2 medium protective yard in accordance with 353 must be established along any side of the property abutting a residential district or a residential use. And as proposed, it would provide a qualifier that where a fuel pump island is located within 100 feet of a residential district or residential use, that same protective yard is required. So instead of it just instead of it only being triggered or being triggered when the districts or when the property abuts that residential district or residential use, now it would only come into play when the fuel pump island is within 100 feet of the residential district or residential use.
Okay, okay. Thanks. Carmen, can you take this back down? I think I need to see the total screen. Thanks. After seeing that committee, do we have any questions before moving forward, before we take a vote or entertain a motion? Commissioner Dattell.
Thank you. I guess my only thought is I think the text change makes a lot of sense, and especially given that condition that we're talking about. I think my only question, and I don't feel super strongly about this, but is 100 feet enough? Like if this is something that we don't run into on a regular basis, and you know, in this particular instance, we're close to 500 feet. I mean, is there any reason why we wouldn't make that even greater? I mean, is 200 feet unreasonable? I don't know. I guess maybe it's not that big of a deal. I'm just kind of wondering if this is, you know, if we feel like 100 feet is probably right, well, then maybe 200 feet is definitely right. And then if this is not really an issue anywhere else, except in these unusual one-off conditions, then maybe this kind of covers that without making it too likely that we'll have a situation that's unreasonable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Commissioner Dattell. Any other questions or comments regarding this text change? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Elder.
I guess, is there any more discussion on what Commissioner Dattell just, that what you say makes a lot of sense to me. I'm over here trying to think of situations that I know of where I have a good mental image of what that distance is, and trying to see how much, like, get a sense of how much 100 feet is, but it's a little I don't know, it's a little tricky just to kind of feel that out. So I'm with you. If we don't come across this very often, and why not make it more than 100 feet? I don't know if anybody else has a strong feeling towards that, or for staff, if there was some sort of calculation on how we got to 100 feet.
Thanks, Commissioner Elder. Keegan, can you just real quick walk us through how we came up with 100 feet, and would staff be amenable to maybe increasing that to maybe 200 feet or more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think 100 feet it's used elsewhere throughout the code. There's a lot of different distance and separation requirements, so it really just it sort of depends, I think, and also what the opinion of whoever was considering it at the time was. But, you know, for instance, the general neighborhood transitions, and give me one moment, I just want to make sure I don't misspeak here, but in looking at a general neighborhood transition zone, for instance, combining the protective yard, use restricted area, and the heightened form spaces, that's 100 feet for general neighborhood transitions. I know certain uses like towing, excuse me, not towing yards, outdoor animal care is 150. Car washes, incidentally, are 200. So there's not really any complete magic number. I know for reference, there was a recent text change on outdoor bar seating that has moved through, and it's actually up for consideration. And in that particular instance, we chose 100 feet because that's the distance at which typically noise volumes at or about 85 decibels could be reduced down to approximately 40 or 45 decibels, which is sort of average neighborhood volume. So if that provides any logic to the committee, but those are the most recent kind of experiences with the separation requirement.
Thanks, Keegan. Commissioner Lampman.
I'm relatively fine with 100 feet. I'm even wondering if 200 might be too restrictive as people are looking at planning and development. It takes up a lot of maybe odd space on a design standpoint when you're looking at land use. So I would actually encourage 100 feet. Just kind of some of my thoughts.
Commissioner Fox, I saw you shaking your head. Did you have any? You can't, you're mute. No, can't. Just give us a thumbs up if you're okay. Okay. Thanks. So I think I'm fine with the 100 feet as well. I really am not opposed to increasing it. I don't have strong feelings either way. Commissioner Raines, I hadn't heard from you, and Commissioner Bennett, I hadn't heard from you on this matter either. So I'd just like to see what you guys are thinking. Commissioner Raines.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm fine with 100 feet. I just want to make sure that we're not going to pass this and then something else happens down the road that has a auxiliary car wash or other sort of service that's going to create noise, light, pollution, that sort of thing next to a residential area. So sounds like this captures most of those conditions. And if there's already a case of 200 feet for specific car wash use, I'm in support of this.
Okay.
I agree. I was trying to think, like Commissioner Raines, what might be any unintended consequences of this, but it sounds like it's covered. In this particular case, I'm really familiar with that site. Where they're proposing to put it is on the opposite end from the residential. So I'm trying to picture 100 feet if it were actually right up against the residential. And, what might be the impacts of, say, vehicles queuing up right up against the residential? Would 100 feet be enough? But if staff has looked at it and thinks it's enough, I don't think I feel strongly enough to vote against it.
Okay. Mr. York, was this, can we just, with the motion, if we have a motion, we would be moving it out of committee of the whole into full planning commission for a vote, or can we do that now?
Yes, the planning commission itself has to make the recommendation. We have been treating the committees less formal, so we've allowed, a showing of hands for votes, because the planning commission, in making its official recommendation, will have to use the roll call vote. So
Okay.
that's what you're getting to.
That's what I'm getting to. So I'm getting to a show of hands to move this out of committee of the whole to the full planning commission so that we can make a motion to approve this at our next planning commission meeting. Did I state that correctly? Yes. Okay. So
actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you can choose to make the motion to recommend approval if that's the direction you're going in. Just and vote by show of hands, and then when you get to the planning commission, the committee report out would be a roll call.
Okay.
So you can actually make the recommendation here.
Okay, so by show of hand, we recommend to approve zoning case TC 1321 by show of hands. All in favor? Okay. Any opposed? Seeing none, that vote is unanimous. Do we have any other comments or reports from the committee members before we adjourn today's meeting? Commissioner Raines.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I brought up a question / comment about large zoning cases at my last meeting attendance about having. I wanted to get your opinion on having a rezoning case of a project that it would encompass 12 stories or more, asking the applicant to provide some graphics, whether it's cross sections or an actual massing model, to indicate what they are proposing the maximum build to mass would be relative to adjacent properties. my personal opinion, I think if the applicant is looking at a project that large, it is not unreasonable to ask them to provide something along those lines to help the public and the commissioners and council understand what's being proposed or what could be built based on their application. So I just wanted to kind of throw it out to the committee here to see what thoughts they may have and staff to see if there's any considerations or issues with that recommendation.
So I don't mind answering the question for you. What I might suggest is that you bring this up at the next planning commission meeting and then ask for discussion at one of the subcommittees and refer the topic to a subcommittee, and there could be a more rich discussion about the impact of requesting this.
Mr. York.
While we do try to be less formal in the committee, we still need a second to your motion. I don't think anyone actually seconded your motion. We don't want to totally throw Robert's rules out the window.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so I see a second from Commissioner Fox.
all right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or reporting from the committee members before we end today's meeting? This was a short one, by the way, too. This was 30 minutes. Okay, seeing none, you guys have a blessed afternoon, and we will see you at our next meeting. Thank you, guys.